Okay, so that's some of the history, how we got here, the opportunity we've had to talk about things, what some of the current standards are, and the speed limits, those types of things. So now let's talk about where we go from here. Now that we have a project as funded by the City Council, we have to consider how we're going to move forward. And there are a number of processes here. First off, we'll talk about the bridge design itself. We are in the process right now of obtaining a design consultant. We put out a document called a request for qualifications back in early September. That is something that's publicized, and then qualified engineering firms who feel that they can provide us design services submit their statement of qualifications to the city, and the city then chooses a consultant out of that group, and then ultimately will contract with that firm and give them a notice to proceed to start the design of the bridge itself. We're anticipating that that notice to proceed would be issued in sometime early November. And you can see here on the right, there's the request for qualifications, selection of the firm in October, doing the design contract in the latter part of October, and then essentially getting folks started in early November. That would ultimately lead to a bridge design that we would put out for bids somewhere around March of next year for the construction of the bridge itself. We would anticipate that that construction would really run probably from April. Well, we'd award the contract in about April, and it would run essentially May through sometime late in the year, October, November of 2018, for completion of the bridge component. Now, the parallel process that would be going along with this is the corridor assessment. And it's what we're calling it, but essentially it's the idea here is we want to take a look at the entire corridor from from Washington Street all the way to Mountain View, and look at how we treat this entire corridor. What is there, what may change, what perhaps should change with changes that occur within the traffic patterns as the bridge is installed. And so that is a process that we'd be doing at the same time that the bridge itself is being designed. Okay? So you'll see it in here in the schedule where we've got a corridor enhancements assessment essentially happening November through March, so they're through the winter, and then that we would be looking at potential construction of those corridor improvements in that same time frame of May through October of 2018. So the bridge itself, in terms of what will it look like, is somewhat driven by the city's adopted standards. This drawing on the right, which is too small to read, but I will tell you it's an adopted city standard for minor arterials, so it lays out what that street section should look like, and this is where those numbers came from in the chart for minor arterials that talked about the number of lanes and the bike lanes and the size of the sidewalks. That's within this adopted city standard. This was adopted by the City Council back in 2014 by resolution. And in terms of how we would apply it to the corridor itself, this is what we would anticipate would be on the bridge section itself. So we're still looking at 2 vehicle lanes, which is what's out there today, 2 bike lanes that would pass through the area on the bridge, sidewalks on both sides, and most likely we would match the existing street width. And I say that specifically because the standard here is the 36 feet. The existing road on either side of the creek is 44. So most likely, instead of trying to neck the curb down and back out, we would probably just hold that 44 right through the bridge and just match that existing road section that is there today. So that would give us enough room to put in the bike lanes and the vehicle lanes and a sufficiently sized sidewalk. So that's what we're anticipating the bridge configuration to be, and we'll carry that concept into design. Now, in terms of the corridor assessment, there are a lot more moving parts here. So we'll take a few minutes and kind of talk about what those are. The idea, again, as I mentioned, is to run all the way from Washington to Mountain View. So look at the entire corridor, not just the area around the bridge itself. It's something that staff will be doing. So it's an in-house assessment that we'll be working on with help from the Transportation Commission. We will be looking at a variety of different aspects within the corridor and assessing what the changes in traffic patterns might mean to those different aspects in the corridor. So to talk about what some of those are. On-street parking. Obviously there's parking on one or both sides of the street pretty much throughout the corridor. It varies depending on where you are. It changes sides of the street when it's only on one side. And in a lot of places it's on both sides. So there's parking there. We don't necessarily anticipate any changes in the parking at this stage, but that's why we do an assessment to see if there's any reason to make any changes out there. Bicycle facilities are a big one. These pictures represent some recent activities that we've installed. It's the beginning of some of the bike facilities along the corridor. This is actually the buffered bike lane. That's a door zone buffer on the right side there between the bike lane and the cars heading up the hill by the high school. That was installed here in the last month, and it's part of the overall 2016 bike facilities and bike routes plan that was adopted by City Council, was to start installing these kind of facilities. So we'll be looking overall at the corridor and what other kind of facilities might be installed beyond what we've already put in so far. This map is an excerpt out of that 2016 plan, bike routes and facilities plan adopted by the council. So here's the high school. This is 3rd Street in blue, and that kind of a railroad track pinky hatch you see there, that represents bike lanes. And then those lines with the little red dots represents shared travel lanes or shared vehicular lanes. So we would put down what we call sharrows, which is these guys right here, so that the drivers know that the bikers are going to be sharing the lane with them. So what we're looking at is once you hit the top of the hill, Polk Street on through past, essentially almost to Blaine, or just past Blaine, excuse me, we'd be doing shared roadway through there. And the reason for that, it's only a 30-foot wide road, so there's not really room to put in dedicated bike lanes as we normally see them. And then once the road widens out to the 44 feet east of there all the way to Mountain View and someday beyond, we envision bike lanes through that corridor. So that's the bike lanes on the bike piece that we talked about a minute ago. So that's what's been envisioned as far as the plan. And so we'll be looking at bike facilities and how they fit into the overall scheme of the corridor as part of the assessment. Traffic control, right now, with the exception of Hayes and Blaine, every side street that approaches 3rd is stop control, is a two-way stop system, so just north-south stops. East-west is free-flowing. At Hayes, it's just the opposite, as well as at Blaine, where east-west stop and north-south is free-flowing. We'll be looking at that to see if any changes are appropriate throughout the corridor in terms of how that stop control is currently in place. School zones, we do have school zone out there for Lena Whitmore. It is on 3rd Street as well as Blaine. And this map shows the school zone. The red represents, red dot or star represents location of Lena Whitmore Elementary School. 3rd Street is here, Blaine here, and 1st. So everything here you see in yellow is generally where the current school zone area is located. I will tell you it grew in 2012. It used to be that 3rd Street was not within the school zone. It started just north of the intersection. And we did a review of all our school zones back in 2012, felt that this particular one should be expanded just because of the proximity to the school. So it grew to what you see here on the map to include a portion of 3rd Street as well. Again, with something we'll look at. At this point, I don't anticipate any changes to this, but it's something that we want to consider as part of the overall picture. Pedestrian facilities, as I mentioned earlier, transportation looked at this once upon a time. One of the things we identified back then in 2005 and 2007 was that I think there were 7 parcels along the corridor that do not currently have sidewalk. So we would look at whether or not it made sense to include sidewalks within the corridor as part of the overall corridor improvements, just to make sure that we've got a fully functional pedestrian route within this corridor. So just the areas where we don't have sidewalks at all in that consideration, but also looking at whether or not we have compliant ramps, ADA ramps, at all of those locations along the route. Public art is a component. All public works facilities and projects within the city of Moscow that are above ground have to essentially put 1% of the project cost towards public art. We don't know yet what public art in this project might look like if it is included in the project itself. There is the alternative to make a payment to the Public Arts Fund in lieu of including it in the project. That's something we'll have to take a look at. I just grabbed a few examples of public arts type things that perhaps could be done from other facilities out there across the country, just to give you some ideas. We do also consider historic lighting or some kind of special lighting perhaps to be part of a public art option. So don't know yet how that will be, but that's something we'll want to talk about in the process of looking at the corridor itself. The last big piece in the overall assessment is traffic calming. And as I mentioned earlier, the transportation plan recommended that the bridge go in, but that traffic calming be included within the corridor. And traffic calming and mobility and accessibility are things the city has worked on off and on for years. At times we've made the paper about, activities that we've had. This particular one had to do with the Mobility Task Force, which was a subset of the Transportation Commission looking at overall accessibility within the community. But traffic calming is something that I guess there's a lot of different perspectives on what it is. So one of the more common definitions is here, which is that traffic calming uses physical design and other measures to improve safety for motorists, pedestrians, and cyclists. It aims to encourage safer, more responsible driving and potentially reduce traffic flow. Potentially reduce traffic flow. The big deal with traffic calming is managing speed, because speed is the issue. When you start looking at conflicts that can exist between bicycles and cars or pedestrians and cars, it's what's called a speed differential. So is the car going that much faster than the other mode so that if they interact, there's a real problem, right? So traffic calming is intended to bring the speed of the vehicles down so that that speed differential is as little as possible. Okay? So it isn't necessarily meant to divert traffic or discourage people from using roadways, but it is meant to really address the speed at which people traverse a particular corridor. So that's the thing to keep in mind as you're going through this. The idea is to improve safety and do it through managing the speed of the vehicles. There are different ways to do traffic calming. A lot of them, I've just thrown a couple of quick examples up here, things that we'll look at as possibilities. This is a technique we've used in the city already. We're called curb extensions or curb bulbs, where the curb line that's running along the side of the street jogs towards the center line at intersections. Usually it's about the width of a parking lane if there's one there. And the idea is that the width of the roadway at the intersection is then narrowed. And anytime you narrow things, people feel constrained, they tend to slow down. You manage the speed. Okay. So that's one of the techniques. Another way is actually just using bike lanes. By installing bike lanes, you're potentially reducing the size of the travel lanes for the vehicles. Typical travel lanes are 12 or 14 feet wide. If you can get them down to 12 or maybe even 11, that again, they feel constricted, they start to slow down, which then manages the speed issue. So bike lanes are a possibility. Where the room exists, that's part of the plan, actually, where the room exists, but also as part of a traffic calming measure, either with or without parking. Other things that are out there, just again, there are many different options. This is called a speed hump. Don't know if it's something we would do or not, but it's something we'll look at as part of the overall picture. Very gentle elevation of the roadway system. In this case, it's where the crossing is. For pedestrians, it does cause people to want to slow down a little bit so they don't hit it too quickly. This is an interesting idea where they actually take parking and alternate sides of the street, which then means the center line of the street has to kind of move over, a little bit of a chicane option. So it's just this gentle little movement, which again causes people to slow down a little bit. So managing speed. Funding. Funding's been a question, and one of the things that the city has been working to do over a number of years is really develop a strategic plan, which we did a couple of years ago, and then to implement that strategic plan on an annual basis. So the city did create a strategic plan, and out of that created some major challenge areas that it wanted to address in the near term. One of those had to do with mobility of all modes of transportation through the community. And so in the 2018 budget, the inclusion of the 3rd Street Bridge actually does comply with the desire of the council within the strategic plan to address some of the east-west mobility within the community. So for the bridge, what is currently in the 2018 budget is adopted by the City Council is in the Capital Projects Fund is $580,000 for the construction of the bridge structure itself. Okay. So that is a specific line item within the budget for that purpose. as it relates to the corridor, we don't currently have a specific line item, but the staff has identified funding sources that are potentially available for whatever projects come out of the assessment, and they could vary, so then the programs vary. One of those would be the sidewalk program. I mentioned possibly filling gaps within the corridor. That would be sidewalk money. Another would be pavement management program that could use some of that funding towards improvements to the road system itself. And then there's potential for other capital projects fund revenues to be used towards the corridor traffic calming measures if that ultimately is what is determined by the City Council that we want to build.